The hostess at the Rosewood Bistro smiled nervously as she approached their table for the third time. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry, but there seems to be an issue with your reservation," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I watched from across the dining room as my husband Derek's face went from confusion to anger to something I'd never seen before, genuine fear. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "What do you mean there's an issue?" Patricia Lawson, my mother-in-law, demanded in that imperious tone she'd perfected over 7 decades of getting her way. "We've had this reservation for months. This is our family's Easter tradition." The young hostess glanced toward the kitchen, then back at the table where the entire Lawson clan sat in their Easter finery, 22 people who had just discovered that their annual celebration was about to come to an abrupt end. "I understand, Mrs. Lawson, but the new owner has implemented a policy. Your family is no longer welcome at this establishment." Derek stood up so quickly his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. "This is ridiculous. Get me your manager, now." That's when I stepped forward, my heels clicking against the polished floors of the restaurant I had purchased exactly 72 hours earlier. Every head at their table turned toward me, and I savored the moment when recognition dawned in their eyes. "I am the manager," I said, my voice steady and professional. "I'm also the new owner. And you're right, Derek. Your family is no longer welcome here." The silence that followed was worth every penny of the $2.3 million I'd paid for the Rosewood Bistro. But to understand how we got to this moment, I need to take you back to where it all began. My name is Claire Brennan, though for the past 20 years I'd been Claire Lawson. 20 years of trying to fit into a family that treated me like an unwelcome house guest who'd overstayed her welcome by 2 decades. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I met Derek Lawson in the most ordinary way possible, at a coffee shop in downtown Portland on a rainy Tuesday morning in October 2004. I was 28, running my own restaurant consulting business and living in a tiny studio apartment above a Vietnamese pho place on Hawthorne Boulevard. He was 30, worked in commercial real estate, and had the kind of easy smile that made you forget you were running late for your next appointment. What started as a chance encounter over spilled coffee turned into lunch dates, then dinner dates, then lazy Sunday mornings reading the paper together. Derek was different from the men I'd dated before, stable, ambitious, but not consumed by work the way I was. He came from what he called good stock, though I didn't fully understand what that meant until I met his family. The Lawsons owned 3 successful restaurants in Portland, a catering company, and enough commercial real estate to make them one of the wealthier families in the area. They weren't flashy about their money, but it was there in the details, the way they casually mentioned their vacation home at the coast, their season tickets to the Trailblazers. The fact that Derek had never worried about paying rent, or buying groceries, or any of the mundane financial anxieties that had shaped my 20s. I grew up in Bend, Oregon, the daughter of a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat. My mom, Susan, cleaned office buildings at night and worked at a daycare during the day. I learned early that if I wanted something, I had to work for it. That work ethic served me well when I put myself through business school at Portland State, and it's what drove me to start my consulting business when I was just 25. By the time I met Derek, I had built something I was proud of. My company, Brennan Restaurant Solutions, specialized in helping struggling restaurants turn their operations around. I wasn't just giving advice from a textbook. I had worked every job in the food service industry, from dishwasher to line cook to floor manager. I understood the business from the ground up, and my success rate spoke for itself. Derek seemed impressed by my independence and drive, at least initially. He'd never dated someone who owned their own business, he told me, someone who was so passionate about their work. His family, however, was a different story. The first time Derek took me to meet the Lawsons, they were hosting their annual 4th of July barbecue at their sprawling home in the West Hills. The house was everything I'd imagined: expansive lawn, covered patio with outdoor kitchen, views of Mount Hood in the distance. It was the kind of place I'd driven past as a kid and wondered what it would be like to live somewhere so grand. Patricia Lawson, Derek's mother, greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and a handshake that lasted exactly 1 second too short to be genuinely warm. She was in her early 60s then, perfectly coiffed silver hair, wearing the kind of casual summer dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "So you're the young woman Derek's been telling us about," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone wealthy women use when they're being polite but not necessarily kind. "He mentioned you work with restaurants. How interesting." Frank Lawson, Derek's father, was more direct in his assessment. A big man with calloused hands and a booming laugh, he had built the family business from a single diner into a small empire. He shook my hand firmly and looked me straight in the eye when he asked, "What do you think of our operation, Claire?" "Derek says you know the restaurant business." I knew this was a test, and I chose my words carefully. "From what Derek's told me, you've built something impressive. Growing from one location to multiple concepts while maintaining quality, that's not easy in this industry." Frank nodded approvingly, but I caught Patricia's expression in my peripheral vision. She looked like someone who'd just tasted something slightly off in her wine. The rest of the family was cordial enough. Derek's sister Brenda was 2 years older, married to Tom Murphy, a dentist with a practice in Lake Oswego. She had that particular brand of suburban confidence that came from never having to worry about money, and she peppered me with questions about my business that felt more like an interrogation than genuine interest. "So you help restaurants that are failing?" she asked while we stood around the outdoor kitchen, watching Frank flip burgers with the precision of a short-order cook. "That must be depressing work." "Actually, it's quite rewarding," I replied. "There's nothing like seeing a family business turn around, watching owners regain their confidence and their profit margins." "How noble," she said with a smile that matched her mother's. Derek's younger brother Kevin was 26 and still finding himself, as Patricia liked to put it. He'd graduated from Oregon State with a degree in business, but seemed more interested in rock climbing and craft beer than joining the family business. His girlfriend Linda was sweet enough, a kindergarten teacher who seemed as overwhelmed by the Lawson family dynamics as I was. The children, Brenda's twins Tyler and Madison, who were 8 at the time, and Kevin's stepson Ryan, who was 10, were the bright spots of that first gathering. They didn't care about my background or my business, or whether I fit into their family's idea of suitable girlfriend material. They just wanted someone to play catch with them in the backyard, and I was happy to oblige. It was during one of these impromptu games that I overheard the conversation that should have been my first real warning. I'd gone into the house to use the bathroom and was heading back outside when I heard Patricia and Brenda talking in the kitchen. "She seems nice enough," Brenda was saying in that diplomatic tone people use when they're about to say something not very nice. "She's not what I expected," Patricia replied. "Derek usually dates girls from better families." "Better families." Brenda's voice carried a note of surprise. "You know what I mean. Girls with similar backgrounds. This one's very self-made." She said self-made the way someone might say contagious disease. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing, Mom. Derek seems happy." "Happiness isn't everything, sweetheart. Marriage is about compatibility, about shared values and similar backgrounds. This girl is nice, I'm sure, but she doesn't understand our world." I stood frozen in the hallway, holding my breath and trying to decide whether to retreat to the bathroom or continue outside and pretend I hadn't heard anything. Before I could make a decision, Derek appeared at the sliding door. "There you are," he said, his face lighting up when he saw me. "The kids are demanding a rematch. They claim you were going easy on them." I forced a smile and followed him back outside, but Patricia's words echoed in my head for the rest of the afternoon. She was right about one thing: I didn't understand their world. What I didn't realize then was how much effort they would put into making sure I never would. Despite the undercurrents of disapproval, Derek and I continued dating. He was good to me in all the ways that mattered. He supported my business, bragged about my successes to his friends, and made me laugh in ways I hadn't experienced before. When he proposed 18 months later, on a beach in Cannon Beach during a weekend getaway, I said yes without hesitation. The engagement period was when the Lawson family dynamics really began to show themselves. Patricia immediately took charge of wedding planning, which should have been my first clue about how the rest of our marriage would unfold. She had opinions about everything: the venue, the flowers, the menu, the guest list, and she expressed these opinions with the certainty of someone who had never been told no. "I've spoken to the Heathmen," she announced, during what was supposedly our first wedding planning meeting. "They can accommodate us on June 15th. It's a beautiful space, very elegant." I had been thinking about something more intimate, maybe the Botanical Gardens, or one of the smaller historic venues in the city. "That's generous of you to look into it, Patricia, but Derek and I haven't really discussed venues yet." "Oh, but dear, the Heathmen is perfect for a Lawson wedding. We've hosted several events there, and they know exactly how to handle our kind of celebration." Our kind of celebration. I was beginning to understand that everything in the Lawson family came with qualifiers like this. Derek, to his credit, tried to mediate. "Mom, maybe Claire and I should visit a few places together before we decide." Of course, sweetheart, but you know how quickly the good venues book up. I just wanted to make sure we had options. This became the pattern for every wedding decision. Patricia would present what she framed as helpful suggestions, but they always came with implied deadlines or limited alternatives that made her preferences seem like the only reasonable choices. The flowers had to come from the florist the family had used for decades. The photographer was someone Patricia had worked with for previous Lawson events. The menu needed to be appropriate for our guests. I found myself compromising on details I had cared about and defending decisions I hadn't even been allowed to make. When I mentioned to Derek that I felt steamrolled by his mother's enthusiasm, he assured me she just wanted everything to be perfect. She did the same thing for Brenda's wedding, he said. It's how she shows love, by taking care of all the details so you don't have to stress about them. But I wanted to stress about them. Planning events was literally my profession, and I had ideas about how I wanted my own wedding to look and feel. More importantly, I wanted to feel like an equal partner in these decisions, not a beneficiary of Patricia's charitable event planning. The wedding itself was beautiful by any objective measure. The Heathman was indeed elegant. The flowers were gorgeous.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
And the photographer captured every moment with professional precision. But as I stood at the altar looking out at 300 guests, most of whom I had never met, I felt more like an actress in someone else's production than the bride at her own wedding. My side of the aisle was notably smaller. My mom was there, of course, beaming with pride and wearing the navy dress we'd picked out together at Nordstrom Rack. A handful of college friends, some colleagues from the restaurant industry, and my neighbor Mrs. Chen, who had become like a surrogate grandmother to me, filled out my section. The disparity was obvious enough that several people commented on it, though always in that politely puzzled way that made me feel more self-conscious rather than less. Claire doesn't have much family, I overheard Patricia explaining to someone during the cocktail hour. It's really quite sad. I wasn't sad about my small family. My mom had raised me to be independent and strong, and the friends I'd chosen felt more like family than many blood relatives do. But standing in that ballroom, surrounded by Lawsons and their extensive network of Portland society, I began to understand that my perspective on what mattered would always be the minority opinion. The reception was flawless by Patricia's standards, but I found myself watching the clock and looking forward to our honeymoon in Costa Rica, where Derek and I could finally be alone and start our marriage on our own terms. Those first few months of married life were probably the happiest of our relationship. We found a house in the Alberta district, a 1920s craftsman that needed work but had good bones and a yard big enough for the garden I'd always wanted. Derek's real estate connections helped us get a good deal, and I threw myself into renovations with the same energy I brought to everything else. My business was thriving too. Word of mouth had brought me steady clients, and I was starting to get referrals from outside Portland. I had helped turn around a struggling bistro in Salem, consulted on the opening of a farm-to-table restaurant in Hood River, and developed a reputation for being able to diagnose operational problems quickly and implement solutions that actually worked. Derek seemed proud of my success, at least when we were alone. He would ask about my projects, celebrate when I landed new clients, and listen patiently when I needed to vent about difficult owners or challenging situations. But I noticed that when we were with his family, he talked about my work differently. Claire's been helping some restaurants get back on their feet, he would say, as if I were volunteering at a soup kitchen rather than running a profitable consulting business. When I pointed this out, he looked genuinely confused. I'm not downplaying what you do. I'm proud of your work. Then why do you make it sound like a hobby when you talk to your family? They don't really understand the consulting world. I try to explain it in terms they'll relate to. But I was beginning to suspect that the issue wasn't their understanding of consulting, it was their understanding of me as someone whose opinion and expertise mattered. This became more apparent as we settled into the rhythm of Lawson family life. There were standing dinner invitations every other Sunday, holiday celebrations that followed traditions established long before I arrived, and family meetings about the business that I was never quite included in, even though my professional experience was directly relevant. I remember the first time I offered input about one of their restaurants. We were at Sunday dinner, and Frank was lamenting the declining profits at their newest location, a casual Italian place that had opened 6 months earlier. The food costs are killing us, he was saying. And we can't seem to keep good servers. These were exactly the kinds of problems I solved for clients every week. Have you looked at your portion size? I asked. Sometimes a small adjustment to portions can significantly impact food costs without customers noticing. And for server retention, it might be worth evaluating the training program and tip structure. The table went quiet in a way that made me immediately regret speaking up. Frank looked at me with polite interest, the kind of expression you'd give a child who had just offered to help with adult problems. That's an interesting thought, Claire, he said. We've been working with our accountant on some solutions. Patricia jumped in smoothly. How is your garden coming along, dear? I drove by the house last week and noticed you've been busy with landscaping. The subject was changed, and I got the message. My professional opinion was not wanted or needed in family business discussions. Over time, I learned to navigate these subtle exclusions by staying quiet during business conversations and focusing on safer topics like cooking, decorating, and local events. It wasn't that the Lawsons were cruel or openly hostile. They were too well bred for that. They were just indifferent to my perspective in a way that made me feel invisible, even when I was sitting right there. The pattern extended beyond business discussions. When they planned family trips, my schedule was never consulted until after destinations and dates had been decided. When they organized group gifts for birthdays and holidays, my contribution was expected, but my input on what to buy was not solicited. When they reminisced about family stories and traditions, I remained a polite audience rather than someone whose own experiences might be worth sharing. I adapted because I loved Derek, and because I told myself that all families had their ways of doing things. I figured that eventually, as the years passed, I would become more integral to their dynamics. Time would prove me wrong about that assumption. The first few years of our marriage established patterns that would define the next 2 decades. Derek and I were happy in our private life, but our public life, especially our family life, operated according to Lawson rules that had been established long before I arrived. We spent every Easter at the Rosewood Bistro, a tradition that had started when Derek was a teenager. Frank had helped the original owner, Tony Ritchie, secure financing when the restaurant was struggling in the early 1990s. In gratitude, Tony had always reserved their best private dining room for the Lawson family's Easter celebration. It was a beautiful tradition, and I genuinely enjoyed those early Easter dinners. Tony was a character, a third-generation Italian-American, who had inherited both his grandmother's recipe for osso buco and her fierce pride in hospitality. He treated the Lawson family like royalty, but he treated me with the same warmth from my very first visit. When he learned about my consulting business, his eyes lit up. You help restaurants, and you must know this business inside and out. What do you think of my place? I looked around the dining room, taking in the warm lighting, the well-spaced tables, the efficient flow from kitchen to dining area. I think you run a beautiful operation. Mr. Ritchie, the service is excellent, and this osso buco might be the best I've ever had. He beamed at the compliment, and from that point forward, Tony and I had a special connection. He would always make time to chat with me during Easter dinners, asking about my business, and sharing stories about the challenges of restaurant ownership. Sometimes he would joke that if he ever needed help, he knew exactly who to call. You got the eye for this business, Claire, he would say. I can tell. These conversations with Tony became one of my favorite parts of Easter dinner, a reminder that my professional identity mattered to someone in this context, even if it didn't matter to my in-laws. As the years passed, our Easter gatherings grew larger as Brenda and Tom had more children, Kevin married Linda, and various cousins, aunts and uncles joined the celebration. The private dining room at the Rosewood became the center of extended family traditions, Easter egg hunts for the children, toasts to family milestones, group photos that would be framed and displayed in Patricia's house throughout the year. I appeared in those photos, usually standing slightly behind Derek, smiling for the camera while feeling like an observer rather than a participant. But I told myself this was normal, that all families had their internal dynamics, and that my role was to support Derek and be grateful for being included. What I didn't realize was that inclusion was conditional, and that the conditions were about to change in ways I never saw coming. The first real crack in the foundation of my marriage appeared on a Tuesday morning, in March 2015, 11 years after our wedding. I was in my home office reviewing financial projections for a new client, when Derek's phone rang on the kitchen counter. He was in the shower, and normally I wouldn't have paid attention, but the caller ID showed Frank's name, and it was barely 7 in the morning. The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. Then a third time. Something was wrong. I knocked on the bathroom door. Derek, your dad's been calling. It seems urgent. The water shut off immediately. Derek emerged wrapped in a towel, his hair still dripping, and grabbed his phone just as it began ringing for the fourth time. Dad, what's wrong? Derek's face went through a series of expressions as he listened. Confusion, concern, then something that looked like panic. How much? Are you sure? Jesus, Dad, how did this happen? He disappeared into our bedroom, closing the door behind him. I could hear the low murmur of intense conversation, but not the words. 20 minutes later, he emerged dressed for work, but looking like he hadn't slept in days. Everything okay? I asked, though it clearly wasn't. Just some business stuff, nothing for you to worry about. He kissed my forehead in that distracted way that meant his mind was already somewhere else entirely. I might be late tonight, don't wait up. Derek had never been secretive about his family's business before. He didn't usually discuss the details with me, but he'd never actively hidden information either. This felt different. That evening, he didn't come home until nearly midnight. I was reading in bed when I heard his car in the driveway, then the sound of him moving quietly through the house, trying not to wake me. When he finally slipped into bed, he smelled like whiskey and stress. Bad day, I asked softly. You could say that. He lay on his back staring at the ceiling. One of our suppliers filed for bankruptcy. It's going to cost us more than we budgeted to find a replacement. It sounded plausible, but something in his tone made me think there was more to the story. In the restaurant business, supplier issues were common and rarely caused the kind of panic I'd witnessed that morning, but I didn't push. Derek would tell me what he wanted me to know when he was ready, except he never was ready. Over the following weeks, I noticed changes in his behavior that he seemed to think I wouldn't pick up on. Late-night phone calls that he took in his car in the driveway. Weekend meetings that he'd never mentioned before. A tension in his shoulders that never quite disappeared, even during our quiet evenings at home. The changes weren't dramatic enough to cause alarm, but they were noticeable to someone who had shared a bed with him for over a decade. Derek was carrying something heavy, and whatever it was, he had decided not to share the burden with me. In April, I ran into Brenda at the grocery store. She was loading organic produce into her cart while talking loudly on her phone about soccer schedules and parent-teacher conferences. When she saw me, she ended her call abruptly. Claire, how funny running into you here. Her smile was bright but brittle. How are things? Good, thanks. Just stocking up for a dinner party tomorrow night. I gestured to my cart full of ingredients for a meal I was hosting for some of Derek's colleagues. That sounds lovely. You always throw such nice parties. She paused, then added with studied casualness. Derek mentioned you might be expanding your business. Something about opening your own restaurant. I stared at her, completely confused. I'm not opening a restaurant. Where did you hear that? Her face flushed slightly. I must have misunderstood something Mom said. You know how family gossip gets twisted, but I knew Brenda well enough by then to recognize when she was covering for something. Patricia didn't misunderstand things, and she didn't engage in idle gossip. If she had told Brenda I was opening a restaurant, she had a reason for spreading that information. That night, I asked Derek about it. Brenda seems to think I'm planning to open a restaurant. Any idea where that came from? He looked up from his laptop, his expression carefully neutral. No idea. You know how Mom gets ideas sometimes, but why would she get that particular idea? It's pretty specific. Derek shrugged. Maybe she heard you talking about one of your consulting projects and got confused. Does it matter? It did matter though. I couldn't articulate exactly why. The feeling that conversations were happening around me, about me, without my knowledge was becoming impossible to ignore. A few weeks later, I discovered what Derek had been hiding, though not in the way I expected. I was helping my client Sarah Kim renovate her struggling Korean fusion restaurant when she mentioned a rumor she'd heard through the Portland restaurant network. Someone told me the Lawson family is looking to sell one of their properties, she said while we reviewed her updated menu. Is that true? I thought their business was doing well. I wouldn't know, I replied honestly. Derek doesn't really discuss the business details with me. Sarah looked surprised. Really? I would have thought they'd want your input, given your expertise. It was an innocent comment, but it highlighted something I'd been trying not to think about. In 20 years of consulting for restaurant owners, I had never met a family business where the expertise of a family member was so completely dismissed. Most owners would have been thrilled to have a professional consultant in the family, someone who could offer insights and advice without charging fees. The Lawsons had never once asked for my professional opinion about their operations. Not once. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done before. I looked up the public records for the Lawson family's business properties. What I found made my stomach drop. 3 of their 4 restaurant properties had been mortgaged heavily in the past 2 years. The catering company had filed for an extension on their business license renewal, which typically happened when fees were in arrears. Most concerning, there was a lien against their flagship restaurant for unpaid taxes. The Lawson business empire wasn't just struggling, it was in serious financial trouble. That evening, I waited until Derek and I were settled on the couch with our usual glass of wine before broaching the subject carefully. I heard an interesting rumor today about your family's restaurants. Is everything okay with the business? Derek's wine glass paused halfway to his lips. What kind of rumor? Just that there might be some financial challenges. I thought maybe you could use some help. I've worked with a lot of family restaurants through difficult periods. We're fine, Claire. The restaurant business is always cyclical. We've weathered tough times before. I know, but if you need advice about restructuring debt or renegotiating with suppliers, or even just a fresh perspective on operations, I'd be happy to. We don't need your help. The words came out sharper than he'd probably intended. Derek set down his wine and rubbed his forehead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to snap. It's just, Dad's been stressed about some cash flow issues, and the last thing he needs is to feel like we can't handle our own business. It wouldn't be about not being able to handle it. It would be about using all available resources to solve the problem. That's just good business. Claire. Derek turned to face me fully, and his expression was gentler but firm. I appreciate that you want to help. I really do. But this is family business. We'll figure it out. There it was again. Family business. The implication that despite being married to Derek for over a decade, despite being a professional who specialized in exactly these kinds of problems, I was still not quite family enough to be trusted with their real challenges. I nodded and changed the subject, but that conversation lodged itself in my chest like a splinter. That night, lying awake while Derek slept beside me, I found myself wondering what other family business I was being excluded from. The answer came sooner than I expected. In June, Derek announced that he'd be spending the weekend at his parents' house helping with some renovations. This wasn't unusual. The Lawsons frequently enlisted family labor for various projects, and Derek was handy with tools. What was unusual was that he seemed nervous about it. It's just boring stuff, he said when I offered to come help. Painting and basic repairs. You'd be bored out of your mind. I had painted every room in our house and had spent countless weekends helping friends with renovation projects. I definitely wouldn't have been bored. But Derek seemed determined to go alone, so I made plans to catch up on some client work and visit with my mom. That Saturday evening, I decided to surprise Derek by picking up dinner from his favorite Thai place and bringing it to his parents' house. I wanted to see what kind of progress they'd made, and I thought the gesture might be appreciated after a long day of manual labor. I pulled into the circular driveway of the Lawson house around 7 o'clock, carrying bags of pad thai and green curry. Through the large front windows, I could see into the living room, where the entire family appeared to be gathered around the dining table. Not working on renovations. Having what looked like a very serious family meeting. Frank sat at the head of the table with papers spread in front of him. Patricia was taking notes in a leather-bound notebook. Derek, Brenda, Tom, Kevin, and Linda were all leaning forward, engaged in intense discussion. I stood on the front porch for a moment, holding bags of food and feeling like an intruder at my own in-laws' house. Through the window, I could see Derek gesturing emphatically at something on the table. This was clearly not a casual family dinner. Before I could decide whether to ring the doorbell or retreat to my car, Patricia looked up and spotted me through the window. I watched her face cycle through surprise, annoyance, and then a forced smile as she said something to the others at the table. Derek came to the door, and his expression when he saw me was one I'd never seen before. Not anger, exactly, but something close to it. Frustration mixed with what looked almost like betrayal. Claire, what are you doing here? I brought dinner. I held up the bags, feeling foolish. I thought you might be hungry after working all day. We're not working, we're having a family meeting. He stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind him, physically placing himself between me and the house. About what? Maybe I can help. It's private family business, Claire. We've discussed this. The words stung more than they should have. I am family, Derek. I'm your wife. You know what I mean. But I was beginning to think I didn't know what he meant at all. Or rather, I was beginning to understand exactly what he meant, and I didn't like it. How long has this been going on? I asked. These meetings that I'm not invited to. Derek sighed and ran his hand through his hair. It's not about inviting or not inviting. It's about, look, some things are easier to handle within the immediate family first. Then we can discuss them with spouses. Spouses? Linda's in there. Linda's different. How is Linda different? Derek was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him trying to find a way to explain something that probably shouldn't be explained. Finally, he said, Linda grew up in this world. She understands how things work. There it was. After 16 years of marriage, Derek had finally said out loud what his family had been thinking all along. I didn't understand how things worked in their world, and I never would. I handed him the bags of food. You should get back to your meeting. I drove home in a strange state of emotional suspension, not quite angry and not quite sad, but definitely something. That night, I made a decision that would change everything, though I didn't realize it at the time. I started paying attention. Really paying attention. Over the next few months, I began to notice things I'd previously dismissed or ignored. The way conversations stopped when I entered a room during family gatherings. The glances exchanged between Derek and his siblings that seemed to carry meaning I wasn't privy to. The way Patricia would ask Derek to help with something in the kitchen during dinner, leaving me alone with whoever happened to be sitting nearby. I noticed that I was rarely included in family photos, until someone remembered to call me over at the last minute. I noticed that when the family discussed vacation plans or holiday arrangements, they would settle on dates and locations before checking with me about my schedule. I noticed that my opinions were solicited politely and then promptly ignored. Most importantly, I noticed that Derek was changing. The man who had once been proud of my independence and success was becoming defensive about it. When people asked about my business, he would downplay my achievements or redirect the conversation. When I mentioned interesting projects or challenging clients, he would listen with the polite but distant attention you'd give an acquaintance, not a spouse. In September, I had lunch with my friend Marcus Webb, an attorney who had gone to law school with Derek. Marcus and I had stayed friendly over the years, partly because he was one of the few people in Derek's circle who seemed genuinely interested in my work. How are things with the consulting business? He asked over salads at a downtown bistro. I keep hearing your name around town. Sounds like you're making quite a reputation for yourself. Things are good. Busy. I'm actually thinking about expanding, maybe bringing on an associate, taking on larger projects. Marcus nodded approvingly. That makes sense. You've definitely outgrown the solo practitioner model. Have you talked to Derek about it? He might have some insights about scaling a service business. I paused with my fork halfway to my mouth. Derek doesn't really get involved in my business decisions. Really? Marcus looked surprised. That seems odd. I would think he'd be your first sounding board for something like that. It was odd, I realized. In a healthy marriage, your spouse should be the person you turn to for advice about major professional decisions. But Derek had never shown interest in being that kind of partner to me. He was supportive in a general sense, but he didn't engage with the specifics of my work the way I engaged with his. Marcus, I said carefully, can I ask you something? In your experience, is it normal for spouses to be completely excluded from family business discussions? His expression grew more serious. What do you mean? I told him about the weekend meeting, about the financial troubles I'd discovered, about Derek's insistence that these were matters for immediate family only. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Claire, I've known Derek for 15 years. I've never known him to be deliberately cruel. But I think he has some blind spots about family dynamics that come from growing up with money. Meaning that people who inherit wealth sometimes have a different understanding of partnership than people who've had to build their own security. They can compartmentalize business and personal relationships in ways that seem natural to them, but feel exclusionary to others. It was a diplomatic way of saying what I'd been thinking, but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Derek's family saw me as an outsider who had married into their world, not as an equal partner who belonged there by right. That evening, I tried one more time to address the issue directly with Derek. I've been thinking about our conversation a few months ago, about the family meetings. I understand that you want to handle some things internally first, but I feel like I could be more helpful if I understood what challenges you're facing. Derek was reading something on his tablet and didn't look up. We're managing fine, Claire. But what if you're not? What if there are solutions you haven't considered because you're too close to the problem? Like what? I don't know. That's the point. I can't offer suggestions if I don't know what the issues are. Derek finally looked at me, and his expression was patient but tired, like he was explaining something to a child who kept asking the same question. Claire, I appreciate that you want to help, but this isn't your problem to solve. It's ours. Yours, I repeated. The family's. I'm part of the family, you're part of our family. You're my wife, and I love you. But the restaurant business is complicated. There are relationships and obligations that go back decades. There are things you wouldn't understand because you weren't there when they developed. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. So I'll never understand, is that what you're saying? No matter how long we're married, no matter how much experience I have in the industry, I'll never be enough of an insider to have a voice in family decisions. That's not what I said. It's what you meant. Derek set down his tablet and looked at me fully for the first time in the conversation. What do you want from me, Claire? Do you want me to ignore my parents' wishes and insist that you be included in every family discussion? Do you want me to override decades of how we've done things just because you feel left out? The question hung in the air between us. What did I want? I wanted to be valued for my expertise. I wanted my husband to see me as a partner rather than a dependent. I wanted to feel like I belonged in the family I'd married into 20 years ago. But looking at Derek's face, I realized that what I wanted and what he was capable of giving me might be two very different things. I want you to understand why this bothers me. I said finally. I do understand. I just don't know what you want me to do about it. That was the moment I realized that Derek genuinely didn't see a problem with the family's approach to including me. To him, this was just how families worked. Some discussions were for blood relatives, others were for the extended family. It was hierarchical and exclusionary, but it was also traditional and comfortable. He had never had to fight for a place at any table. He had never been the outsider trying to prove their worth. He couldn't understand why I found the family's behavior hurtful because he had never experienced anything like it himself. That night, lying in bed listening to Derek's steady breathing, I made a decision. I was done trying to earn my place in the Lawson family. I was done accepting crumbs of inclusion and being grateful for basic courtesy. I was done pretending that 20 years of marriage didn't entitle me to be treated like an equal. I wasn't sure what I was going to do about it yet, but I knew something had to change. The opportunity to find out exactly what was happening with the family business came sooner than I expected. In October, my client Helen Varga asked me to attend a restaurant industry conference in Seattle with her. Helen owned 2 successful farm-to-table restaurants and had become both a client and a friend over the years. She was sharp, funny, and had built her business with the same kind of determination I respected in myself. I need a wingwoman for this thing, she said over coffee at one of her restaurants. All the major restaurant groups will be there, plus suppliers, investors, the whole ecosystem. It's great for networking, but it can be overwhelming to navigate alone. I agreed to join her, partly because it would be good for my business, and partly because I needed a weekend away from Portland and the increasingly tense atmosphere at home. The conference was held at a waterfront hotel in Seattle, and it was exactly the kind of event I thrived at. Panels on industry trends, networking sessions with potential clients, and informal conversations that led to new business opportunities. I was in my element, discussing operational efficiencies with other consultants and sharing war stories with restaurant owners who had faced similar challenges to my clients. On the second day, I was standing in line for coffee during a break when I overheard a conversation that made me freeze. The Lawson Group is definitely looking for a buyer, a man behind me was saying to his companion. My cousin works for their accountant, says they're in pretty deep trouble. I heard they've been trying to sell for months, the other man replied. But who wants to buy restaurants with that much debt attached? Apparently they're not just selling the restaurants, they're liquidating everything, the catering company, the commercial properties, even some personal assets. It's a complete fire sale. I turned slightly to get a better look at the men talking. I didn't recognize either of them, but they were wearing name tags from a Seattle-based restaurant investment firm. What happened? The first man asked. I thought they were doing well. Same thing that happens to a lot of family businesses. Poor financial management, too much expansion too quickly, and then the economy shifts, and suddenly you're over-leveraged with no way out. Tough spot to be in. Especially when you've got 3 generations depending on the business for their livelihood. I heard Frank Lawson had to take out a second mortgage on his house just to make payroll last month. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. A second mortgage on the house. That beautiful house in the West Hills, where we'd had countless family dinners, where Derek had grown up, where Patricia displayed decades of family photos and treasured antiques. I stepped out of line and found a quiet corner to process what I'd just learned. The Lawsons weren't just facing financial challenges, they were facing financial ruin. And Derek had been hiding this from me for months, while his family held secret meetings to figure out how to salvage what they could from the wreckage of their empire. The betrayal was complete. Not only had they excluded me from family discussions that could have benefited from my expertise, but they had allowed me to remain ignorant about a crisis that would inevitably affect my own financial security. Derek and I owned our house jointly, but if his family's business collapsed, there could be legal implications. Creditors might come after family. Our own stability could be at risk. And I had been kept in the dark about all of it. That evening, Helen and I had dinner at a seafood restaurant near Pike Place Market. I was distracted, picking at my salmon, while she told stories about her early days in the restaurant business. Finally, she set down her fork and looked at me directly. Okay, what's going on? You've been somewhere else all day. I debated whether to confide in her, then decided I needed to talk to someone who would understand the professional implications of what I'd learned. Helen, what would you do if you discovered that your family was facing major financial problems, but they'd been hiding it from you and refusing your help, even though you have exactly the expertise they need? She raised an eyebrow. Is this a hypothetical question? Not exactly. I told her everything. The months of secretive behavior, the family meetings I wasn't invited to, the conversation I'd overheard at the conference. Helen listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious, as I explained the extent of the Lawsons' financial troubles. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Claire, you know I think the world of you. Your business instincts are excellent, and you've helped turn around some impossible situations. But I have to ask, are you sure you want to get involved in this? What do you mean? Family businesses are complicated in ways that regular consulting gigs aren't. There are emotional dynamics, power structures, and old resentments that can make even the best professional advice impossible to implement. And from what you've told me about your in-laws, it sounds like they've made it pretty clear that they don't want your input. I knew she was right, but something in me rebelled against the idea of just walking away, so I should just let them fail. Let Derek's family lose everything, because they're too proud to accept help. You should protect yourself, Helen said firmly. If they're in as much trouble as it sounds like, and they're not being transparent with you about it, then you need to make sure your own assets are secure. Have you talked to a lawyer about your potential exposure? I'd been so focused on feeling hurt and excluded that I hadn't considered the practical implications of being married to someone whose family was facing financial collapse. Helen, what if there was a way to help them whether they wanted it or not? What if there was a way to protect their assets and salvage their business, even if they were too proud to ask for it? She studied my face carefully. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that sometimes the best solutions come from unexpected directions. And I'm thinking that maybe it's time for the Lawsons to learn that excluding people from important conversations doesn't always work out the way they expect. Helen smiled, but there was concern in her eyes. Claire, whatever you're planning, just be careful. Family dynamics have a way of getting messy quickly, especially when money is involved. I nodded, but I was already formulating a plan. If the Lawsons wanted to handle their business as family only, then maybe it was time for me to handle my business the same way. The flight back to Portland gave me 3 hours to think through what I'd learned, and what I wanted to do about it. By the time we touched down at PDX, I had made several decisions. First, I was going to protect my own financial interests by consulting with Marcus about potential legal exposure from Derek's family's debts. Second, I was going to start paying very close attention to the Lawsons' business situation, using my industry connections to stay informed about their attempts to sell their properties. Third, I was going to stop trying to be included in family discussions and start taking actions that would make my inclusion irrelevant. And fourth, I was going to prepare for the possibility that my marriage to Derek might not survive what was coming. I didn't want that last possibility to be true, but I was finally ready to acknowledge that Derek and I might have fundamental incompatibilities that couldn't be resolved through compromise or patience. If he couldn't see me as an equal partner after 20 years of marriage, maybe he never would. That evening, Derek picked me up at the airport with flowers and a smile that looked genuinely happy to see me. "How was the conference?" he asked as we drove through the evening traffic toward home. "Informative," I said. "I learned a lot about current market conditions and investment trends. Good networking." "Very good. I made some interesting connections." Derek seemed relaxed and cheerful, asking questions about the panels I'd attended and the restaurants Helen and I had visited. He appeared genuinely interested in my professional activities, which felt ironic given what I now knew about his family's situation. When we got home, I unpacked while Derek made dinner. We ate together on the couch, watching a movie and talking about our respective weekends. It felt normal and comfortable, like the early years of our marriage, but underneath the domestic tranquility, something had changed. I was no longer the woman who would accept exclusion gracefully and wait for permission to contribute. I was no longer willing to pretend that my expertise didn't matter or that my perspective wasn't valuable. Derek didn't know it yet, but the Lawson family's financial problems were about to become my business, whether they wanted it to be or not. And unlike their approach to family business, my approach was going to be thorough, strategic, and completely transparent. They had spent months meeting in secret, making plans without me, and treating me like an outsider looking in. Now they were about to discover what it felt like when the outsider started looking back. The Monday morning after returning from Seattle, I sat in my home office with a cup of coffee and a legal pad, doing something I'd never done before in 20 years of marriage. I was investigating my husband's family like they were potential clients whose books didn't add up. My first call was to Marcus Webb. His secretary put me through immediately, and I could hear the concern in his voice when I explained why I needed to see him. "Claire, I have to ask, are you thinking about divorce?" "I'm thinking about protecting myself," I replied. "I need to understand what my legal exposure might be if Derek's family business collapses." "That's smart. Can you come in this afternoon? I'll need to review your financial documents and get a full picture of how your assets are structured." 3 hours later, I sat in Marcus's downtown office while he spread papers across his conference table. Bank statements, property deeds, tax returns, and business incorporation documents created a map of my financial life that I'd never examined this closely before. "Good news first," Marcus said, adjusting his reading glasses. "Your business is completely separate from Derek's family interests. Brennan Restaurant Solutions is solely owned by you, with no cross-guarantees or shared liabilities. Your business assets are protected. And the bad news: your house is jointly owned, which means if Derek faces personal liability from family business debts, creditors could potentially force a sale. Also, you've been filing joint tax returns, which creates some shared responsibility for any tax issues." Marcus pulled out a calculator and started running numbers. "If the family business has been operating at a loss, and Derek has been personally guaranteeing business loans, you could be looking at significant exposure. How much do you know about his personal financial situation?" "Apparently less than I thought," I admitted. "He handles most of our joint finances. I focus on my business, he manages the household accounts and investments." Marcus frowned. "Claire, I'm going to say something as both your lawyer and your friend. You need to get copies of everything immediately. Bank statements, credit reports, loan documents, investment accounts. If Derek has been hiding the extent of his family's problems from you, he might also be hiding personal financial decisions that could affect you." That afternoon, I did something that felt deeply wrong but absolutely necessary. While Derek was at work, I went through our home office systematically, photographing every document I could find. Bank statements showed that Derek had been making large cash withdrawals over the past 6 months, amounts that should have required discussion between spouses but had never been mentioned to me. Our joint investment account had been depleted by nearly 40% since the beginning of the year. When I checked the transaction history, I found transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, all approved with Derek's electronic signature alone. The most damning discovery was a folder hidden in the back of Derek's desk drawer, containing loan applications and credit line documents. Derek had applied for a personal line of credit using our house as collateral. The application was dated 3 months earlier, and it had been approved for $250,000. I photographed everything, then carefully returned the documents to their original positions. That evening, when Derek came home from work, I watched him closely for any signs that he suspected I'd been investigating. He seemed normal, tired but not unusually stressed, asking about my day and sharing harmless details about his own. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. This was the man who had shared my bed for 20 years, who knew my coffee order and remembered to record my favorite TV shows. He was also the man who had secretly mortgaged our home without telling me, who had been draining our joint accounts to prop up his family's failing business while excluding me from any knowledge of the crisis. Over dinner, I tested the waters carefully. "How are your parents doing? Your mom seemed a little stressed at Sunday dinner last week." Derek paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. "She's fine. Why? Just seemed like she had a lot on her mind. Sometimes when people are dealing with financial pressure, it shows in their behavior." "Mom's not dealing with financial pressure, Claire. Where would you get that idea?" The lie came so easily, delivered with such casual confidence, that I almost doubted my own evidence. But I had seen the documents. I knew the truth, just a general observation. "The restaurant business is tough right now, and I know your family takes pride in maintaining their standards." Derek relaxed slightly. "They're doing fine. Dad's always been conservative with money, and Mom worries about things that don't need worrying about. Nothing for us to be concerned with." Us, as if we were a team, as if Derek hadn't been making major financial decisions without consulting me, as if he wasn't sitting across from me spinning elaborate fabrications about his family's situation. That night, after Derek fell asleep, I sat in my home office researching the Lawson family's business holdings more thoroughly. Public records showed a web of interconnected companies, property holdings and financial obligations that was far more complex than I'd realized. The flagship restaurant, Lawson's Prime, had been mortgaged twice in the past 18 months. The catering company had defaulted on an equipment lease and was facing a judgment from a major supplier. Two of the commercial properties had tax liens, and one was scheduled for foreclosure proceedings. But it was the personal financial entanglements that made my blood run cold. Frank Lawson had personally guaranteed most of the business debts, which meant his personal assets, including the family home, were at risk. Derek, as a co-signer on several of the business accounts, was similarly exposed. The house Derek and I lived in, the house I had thought was our secure foundation, could be seized by creditors if the family business collapsed completely. I spent the rest of that week gathering intelligence through my professional network. The restaurant industry in Portland was tight-knit enough that rumors traveled quickly, and I had relationships with suppliers, real estate brokers, and other consultants who knew pieces of the Lawson story. What I learned painted a picture of a family business that had been mismanaged for years, propped up by increasingly desperate financial maneuvers that had only delayed the inevitable reckoning. Frank Lawson, despite his reputation as a savvy businessman, had made a series of poor decisions that had left his empire vulnerable when economic conditions tightened. The family had been trying to sell their properties for months, but potential buyers were scared off by the debt load and the declining performance of the restaurants. They were trapped in a downward spiral where they couldn't afford to keep operating, but also couldn't afford to close. Meanwhile, Derek continued to act as if nothing was wrong. He went to work each day, came home for dinner, and made casual conversation about ordinary things. The only signs of stress were the late-night phone calls and the occasional distracted look when he thought I wasn't watching. On Thursday evening, Derek announced that he'd be spending Saturday at his parents' house again, helping with more projects around the house. "What kind of projects?" I asked. "Just maintenance stuff. Dad wants to get caught up on some repairs before winter." I nodded and made supportive noises about the importance of home maintenance, while internally noting that people preparing to sell their house often invest in cosmetic repairs to improve market appeal. That Saturday, instead of respecting Derek's obvious desire to keep me away from the family meeting, I decided to do some reconnaissance of my own. I drove to the Lawsons' neighborhood and parked where I could see their house without being obvious about it. What I observed over the course of 3 hours was illuminating. Derek's car was there, along with Brenda's SUV and Kevin's truck. But so were vehicles I didn't recognize. a black sedan with professional license plates, and a white van from a company called Portland Estate Services. Through my phone, I looked up Portland Estate Services and discovered they specialized in preparing high-end homes for sale and managing estate liquidation. The black sedan belonged to a commercial real estate firm that handled restaurant and hospitality properties. The Lawsons weren't having a family meeting about repair projects. They were meeting with professionals to discuss selling their assets. While I sat in my car watching strangers evaluate the family home where I'd attended countless dinners and celebrations, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt and confusion I'd been carrying for months crystallized into something sharper and more focused. The Lawsons had made their choice. They had decided that I couldn't be trusted with knowledge of their crisis, that I couldn't contribute meaningfully to solutions, that I would be a liability rather than an asset in their time of need. Fine. If they wanted to exclude me from their family business, I would conduct my own business accordingly. That evening, when Derek came home looking exhausted and defeated, I was ready with a performance of my own. "How did the projects go?" I asked, handing him a beer and settling beside him on the couch. "Slower than expected. Dad's pretty particular about how he wants things done." "Well, I'm sure the house will look great when you're finished. Are your parents thinking about updating anything else? Maybe freshening up the kitchen or bathrooms?" Derek gave me a sharp look. "Why would you think that?" "No particular reason. I just know they take pride in keeping everything in perfect condition." He seemed to relax slightly. "Yeah, Mom's always finding something that needs attention." I let the conversation drift to other topics, but I was already formulating the next phase of my plan. If the Lawsons were meeting with estate services and real estate brokers, they were further along in their liquidation process than I'd realized. Which meant I had less time than I'd thought to position myself advantageously. The following Monday, I called Helen Varga and asked if she'd be interested in getting coffee to discuss a potential business opportunity. We met at a cafe in the Pearl District, not far from where several high-end restaurants had recently changed hands as the Portland dining scene evolved. Helen arrived looking curious and slightly amused. "You sounded very mysterious on the phone," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "What kind of opportunity are we talking about?" "The kind that requires discretion and significant capital investment," I replied. "How much do you know about the current state of Portland's restaurant real estate market?" Helen raised an eyebrow. "Enough to know that there are some interesting properties available for buyers with cash and patience." "Why?" I pulled out a folder containing research I'd compiled over the weekend. Property listings, financial projections, and market analysis for several Portland restaurants that were either for sale or rumored to be available soon. "I'm thinking about expanding beyond consulting," I said. "Instead of just advising restaurant owners, what if I became one?" Helen studied the documents I'd spread on the table, her expression growing more interested as she reviewed the numbers. "Some of these properties have serious potential," she said. "But they'd require significant investment to turn around. Are you thinking about partnerships, or do you have access to that kind of capital?" "I have some ideas about financing. But I'd need partners with experience in restaurant operations and property management, people who understand the industry and can move quickly when the right opportunity presents itself." "How quickly are we talking?" "Potentially very quickly. I think some of these properties might become available sooner than their current owners expect." Helen looked at me carefully. "Claire, this sounds like insider information. Are you sure you want to get into a situation where there might be conflicts of interest?" "I'm sure I want to get into a situation where I have control over my own professional future, instead of waiting for other people to make decisions that affect me." We spent another hour discussing the practical aspects of restaurant acquisition and management. Helen had experience with property investment through her own restaurant expansion, and she knew other investors who might be interested in the right opportunities. By the time we left the cafe, I had the foundation of a partnership that could move quickly when the Lawson properties officially hit the market. That week, I also began preparing my existing business for a potential expansion. I met with my accountant to discuss the financial implications of acquiring restaurant properties. I consulted with my lawyer about the legal structure for a restaurant investment partnership. I even started preliminary conversations with contractors and designers about renovation possibilities. Each evening, Derek would come home and ask about my day, and I would give him the same kind of vague, pleasant responses he'd been giving me for months. Busy day with clients. Some interesting new projects in development. The usual challenges and opportunities. The irony wasn't lost on me. After 20 years of sharing almost everything with Derek, I was now conducting my professional life with the same secrecy he'd been using to conduct his family business. The difference was that my secrets were strategic, designed to protect my interests and position me for future success. His secrets were defensive, designed to maintain control by limiting information. On Friday evening, Derek came home with news that he tried to present casually, but which I could see had shaken him. I might be traveling more for work over the next few months, he said while we prepared dinner together. Dad's thinking about expanding our real estate portfolio, and he wants me to look at some properties in other markets. This was such an obvious fabrication that I almost felt insulted. The Lawsons weren't expanding anything, they were desperately trying to salvage what they could from their collapsing empire. That sounds exciting, I said. What markets is he considering? Oh, the usual Seattle, maybe some opportunities down in California. Just preliminary research at this point. Well, I hope the timing works out okay. I know how much you value our weekends together. Derek looked at me with something that might have been guilt. It won't be permanent, just until we get through this expansion phase. Of course. Family business comes first. That night, lying in bed listening to Derek's restless sleep, I realized that we were both preparing for something, though we were preparing for very different things. Derek was preparing to manage a crisis while continuing to exclude me from knowledge or involvement. I was preparing to take control of my own destiny in ways that would make their exclusion irrelevant. The next morning, while Derek was at the gym, I made a call that would change everything. Tony Ricci. This is Claire Lawson, Derek Lawson's wife. I hope I'm not calling too early. Tony's voice was warm and surprised. Claire, no, not too early at all. How are you, sweetheart? How's the restaurant business treating you? Actually, that's why I'm calling. I wondered if you might have time for coffee this week. I have a business proposition that might interest you. A business proposition? From you? Now you've got my attention. When do you want to meet? We arranged to meet Tuesday morning, at a cafe near the Rosewood Bistro. I spent the weekend preparing for that conversation, researching Tony's financial situation, and developing a proposal that would benefit both of us, while positioning me for what was coming. Because I had finally accepted what Derek and his family had been telling me all along, though not in the way they intended. I wasn't family in their definition of the term. I was an outsider, someone whose perspective and expertise didn't matter in their insular world. But being an outsider also meant being free from the loyalty and sentiment that was preventing them from making rational business decisions. It meant I could see opportunities they were blind to and take actions they were too proud to consider. The Lawsons had spent months protecting themselves from my involvement in their business. Now they were about to discover what my business looked like when I didn't need their protection. Tuesday morning arrived clear and cold, one of those October days in Portland when you could feel winter approaching, but the trees were still showing off their autumn colors. I dressed professionally, but not formally for my meeting with Tony, a businesswoman having a conversation with a colleague, not someone making a desperate pitch. Tony was already at the cafe when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a cup of espresso and the morning paper. He stood to hug me when I approached, his genuine warmth, a stark contrast to the calculated politeness I'd grown accustomed to from the Lawson family. Look at you, he said, beaming. Successful business owner, respected consultant, you've done well for yourself, Claire. Thank you, Tony. You're looking well too. How's business at the Rosewood? His expression clouded slightly. Business is business, Some months are better than others. The restaurant industry, it's always been tough, but these days, he shrugged in that philosophical way of people who've weathered many storms. I ordered a cappuccino, and settled across from him. Tony, I'm going to be direct with you, because I respect you too much to waste your time with small talk. I know you're thinking about selling the Rosewood. His eyebrows rose, but he didn't deny it. News travels fast in this business. It does. And I also know that finding the right buyer for a restaurant like yours isn't easy. Especially a buyer who understands what makes the Rosewood special, and would preserve what you've built there. Tony studied my face carefully. What are you thinking, Claire? I'm thinking about getting into restaurant ownership. Not as an absentee investor, but as someone who understands operations and would maintain the standards you've established. Someone who values the relationships you've built with longtime customers and would honor the traditions that make the Rosewood unique. Like the Lawson family Easter dinners, Tony said with a slight smile. Exactly like that, I replied, though I was thinking something very different from what Tony assumed. We spent the next hour discussing the practical aspects of a potential sale. Tony was motivated to sell, but not desperate, which put him in a stronger negotiating position than many restaurant owners. The Rosewood was profitable and well regarded, with a solid customer base and an excellent reputation. What Tony needed was a buyer who could close quickly and who wouldn't destroy what he'd spent decades building. I'll be honest with you, Claire, he said as we finished our coffee. I've had other offers. Some from restaurant groups that want to change the concept completely. Others from developers who want to tear down and rebuild. Neither of those options feels right to me. What would feel right? Selling to someone who loves this business the way I do. Someone who understands that a restaurant isn't just about profit margins. It's about community, about bringing people together, about creating experiences that matter to people. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. Tony, I can be that buyer. But I need you to understand that if we do this deal, some things might change in ways you don't expect. He looked puzzled. What kind of changes? The kind that happen when someone who's been excluded from important conversations finally gets a chance to make decisions for themselves. Tony was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. Claire, I've known the Lawson family for 25 years. I've watched how they treat you at those Easter dinners, how they talk around you instead of to you. If you want to buy my restaurant and run it your way, I think that might be exactly what this place needs. We shook hands across the table, and I felt a surge of excitement that I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in decades, I was making a major decision that was entirely mine, based on my own judgment and my own goals. The terms we discussed were preliminary, but they were promising. Tony was asking $3 million for the restaurant, including the building, equipment, and existing inventory. He was willing to provide some seller financing, and he'd stay on as a consultant during the transition period. More importantly, he was willing to move quickly if I could demonstrate that I had the financing in place and the experience to make the acquisition successful. That afternoon, I called Helen to update her on the conversation and to formalize our partnership agreement. By evening, I had commitments from 2 other restaurant industry professionals who were interested in joining our investment group. Within a week, we had assembled a team with the capital, expertise, and motivation to acquire the Rosewood Bistro and potentially other Portland restaurant properties as they became available. All that remained was waiting for the right moment to make our move. That moment came sooner than I expected, triggered by an event that finally revealed the full extent of the Lawson family's desperation and the lengths they would go to exclude me from decisions that affected my own life. It was a Wednesday evening, in late October, when Derek came home, looking like he'd seen a ghost. He moved through our house with the mechanical precision of someone in shock, pouring himself a large whiskey and sitting at the kitchen table without acknowledging my presence. Derek, what's wrong? He looked up at me with eyes that seemed to be seeing something far away. We might lose everything. What do you mean? The business, the house, everything, Dad. Miscalculated how much time we had to find buyers. The bank called in our line of credit, and we have 60 days to pay it back in full, or they start foreclosure proceedings on all our properties. I sat down across from him, my heart pounding with a mixture of vindication and genuine concern. How much do you owe? $4.2 million. Total, between the restaurant mortgages, the commercial property loans, and the personal guarantees Dad signed. It was worse than I'd estimated, but not worse than I'd prepared for. What are your options? Derek laughed bitterly. Options? Claire, we don't have options. We've been trying to sell for 8 months. No one wants to touch properties with this much debt attached. We're going to lose everything our family spent 3 generations building. What about restructuring? Negotiating with creditors, bringing in investors. We've tried everything. No one wants to partner with us when we're this over-leveraged. I took a deep breath and made a decision that would change both our lives forever. Derek, what if I told you there might be a way to salvage something from this situation? A way to preserve some of the family assets and keep at least one of the restaurants operating. He looked at me with desperate hope. What do you mean? I mean that there might be buyers for individual properties, even if no one wants to take on the entire portfolio. Someone who could move quickly and had the capital to close deals before the foreclosure deadlines.
Who? We've talked to every restaurant group in Portland. I reached across the table and took his hand.
Derek, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I've been working on something for the past few weeks. I didn't tell you about it because you've made it clear that family business discussions don't include me. But maybe it's time for that to change. Derek's expression shifted from hope to confusion. What are you talking about? I'm talking about me buying the Rosewood Bistro from Tony Ritchie, and potentially other properties as they become available. The silence that followed was deafening. Derek stared at me as if I'd just announced I was planning to fly to the moon. You're buying the Rosewood? I'm in the process of buying it, yes. With partners. We have the financing in place and the expertise to make it successful. You've been planning this behind my back. The irony of that question was so perfect that I almost smiled. I've been planning this using the same approach your family has been using to plan their financial strategies. The difference is that my planning might actually solve problems instead of creating them. Derek stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. Claire, this is insane. You can't just decide to buy restaurants without discussing it with me. Why not? You decided to mortgage our house without discussing it with me. Your family decided to liquidate their assets without discussing it with me. I'm simply following the precedent that's been established. That's different. How is it different? Derek struggled for an answer, and I could see him realizing that there wasn't a logical explanation that didn't acknowledge the double standard that had governed our marriage. Look, I continued, I'm not doing this to hurt you or your family. I'm doing this because I see opportunities that others don't, and I have the resources to act on them. If the Rosewood is going to be sold anyway, why not sell it to someone who will preserve what Tony built and maintain its role in the community, including the Easter dinners? I smiled, and there was something in that smile that made Derek take a step back, especially the Easter dinners. The silence in our kitchen stretched on as Derek processed what I'd just told him. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, trying to reconcile the wife he thought he knew with the woman who had just announced she was purchasing a restaurant without consulting him. Claire, he said finally, his voice careful and measured, I think we need to involve my parents in this conversation. This affects the whole family. Does it? Because for the past year you've all made it very clear that family business doesn't concern me. I'm just following your lead. Derek ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd seen countless times when he was trying to solve a problem that didn't have an easy solution. This is different. You're talking about buying a restaurant where our family has traditions, where we've celebrated every Easter for 20 years. Exactly. I'm preserving those traditions. Isn't that what families do for each other? He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him trying to figure out if I was being sincere or if there was something else going on. The truth was, there was definitely something else going on, but Derek wouldn't understand the full scope of it until much later. I need to call my parents, he said. Of course you do. Derek stepped onto our back patio to make the call, and I used the privacy to text Tony Ritchie a message I'd been prepared to send for days. Ready to move forward immediately. Can we meet tomorrow morning to finalize terms? His response came back within minutes. Absolutely. My lawyer can have papers ready by afternoon. Through the sliding glass door, I could see Derek pacing on the patio, gesturing emphatically as he spoke. Even without hearing the words, his body language told the story of a man trying to explain something he didn't fully understand to people who weren't going to like what they heard. When he came back inside, his expression was grim. They want to meet with us tonight. All of us. They're calling Brenda and Kevin too. A family meeting, I said. How unusual. And I'm invited this time. Claire, please. I know you're angry about being left out of things, and I understand why. But this is serious. If you're really planning to buy the Rosewood, it affects all of us. Derek, I'm not planning to buy the Rosewood. I am buying the Rosewood. The papers will be signed tomorrow afternoon. The color drained from his face. Tomorrow? Claire, you can't make a decision this big without discussing it with the family. I can, and I have. The same way your family has been making decisions without discussing them with me. An hour later, we were driving toward the West Hills in a silence so thick it felt oppressive. Derek kept glancing at me as if I were a stranger he'd just met, someone whose behavior he couldn't predict or understand. The Lawson family home looked the same as always from the outside: perfectly manicured lawn, elegant landscaping, the kind of understated wealth that spoke of generations of financial security. What I now knew, and what they were probably just beginning to accept, was that this security was an illusion that was about to be shattered. Patricia answered the door wearing the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes, the expression she reserved for unpleasant tasks that required good manners. Claire, Derek, come in. Everyone's in the living room. The entire family was indeed assembled, sitting in the same formal arrangement they used for important discussions. Frank in his leather armchair, Patricia on the sofa beside him, Brenda and Tom on the love seat, Kevin and Linda in the matching chairs by the window. It looked like a board meeting, which I supposed it was. Derek and I took the remaining seats, and I noticed that once again, I was positioned slightly outside the family circle. Old habits. Frank cleared his throat in the authoritative way that had probably served him well in decades of business meetings. Derek has told us about your plan to purchase the Rosewood Bistro. We'd like to understand your thinking. My thinking is quite straightforward, I replied. Tony wants to sell, I want to buy, and we've reached mutually agreeable terms. It's a solid investment opportunity. But why that restaurant specifically? Patricia asked. Surely there are other properties that would make more sense for someone just entering restaurant ownership. I smiled, enjoying the irony of her question. Actually, the Rosewood makes perfect sense for me. I'm familiar with the operation, I understand the customer base, and I have a personal connection to the establishment. Plus, Tony is willing to provide seller financing and stay on as a consultant during the transition. Brenda leaned forward, her expression sharp with concern. Claire, you have to understand how this looks. Our family has a 20-year relationship with that restaurant. Our Easter dinners, our celebrations, our history with Tony. It seems opportunistic. Opportunistic. I repeated, savoring the word. That's an interesting choice of terminology, Brenda. Tell me, what would you call your family's approach to managing their financial crisis? Because from where I sit, excluding me from family discussions while secretly mortgaging assets that affect my financial security seems fairly opportunistic too. The room went dead silent. Frank's face flushed red, and Patricia's smile finally disappeared completely. What are you talking about? Frank demanded. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder of photographs I'd taken of Derek's financial documents. I'm talking about the fact that Derek has been making major financial decisions without my knowledge or consent. I'm talking about loans guaranteed against our house, joint accounts depleted to prop up failing businesses, and a family that has spent months meeting in secret to plan their financial strategy while deliberately excluding the one person in this room with professional expertise in business turnarounds. Derek looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. Claire, maybe we should discuss this privately. Privately? Like the way you've been discussing your family's bankruptcy privately. Like the way you've been discussing selling assets privately. No, Derek. I think we're past the point of private discussions. I stood up and walked to the center of the room, positioning myself where everyone had to look at me directly. Here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow afternoon, I will officially become the owner of the Rosewood Bistro. I will honor existing reservations and maintain current staff. I will preserve the restaurant's reputation and continue serving the community that has supported it for decades. And our Easter dinners? Patricia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. That depends entirely on how this family chooses to treat me going forward. If you'd like to continue your Easter tradition, you're welcome to make a reservation like any other customer. But the days of assuming you have special access to private dining rooms without payment are over. Frank stood up, his face now purple with rage. How dare you threaten us? After everything this family has done for you, after welcoming you into our home for 20 years, this is how you repay us. Welcomed me. I laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to make everyone flinch. Frank, you've tolerated me. There's a difference. You've included me in family events the way you might include a +1 at a wedding, acknowledged but not really wanted. That's not true, Derek said. But his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? When have any of you ever asked for my professional opinion about your business challenges? When have you included me in financial planning discussions? When have you treated me like an equal partner in family decisions rather than an outsider who needs information filtered through Derek? Patricia tried to regain control of the conversation. Claire dear, you seem very upset. Perhaps we should all take a step back and approach this more calmly. I am calm, Patricia. I've been calm for months while I watched your family make increasingly desperate financial decisions. I've been calm while Derek hid major loans from me. I've been calm while you all pretended that your business problems didn't affect me, even though my financial security was at risk because of Derek's personal guarantees. I pulled out a folder of documents I'd prepared for this moment. Financial records, loan applications, property liens, and credit reports that painted a comprehensive picture of the Lawson family's financial situation. I've been calm while I conducted my own investigation into your business affairs, since you clearly weren't going to share that information voluntarily. Would you like to know what I discovered? The fear in their faces was almost comical. These people who had spent their lives managing information and controlling narratives were suddenly facing someone who had more complete information than they did. You've been insolvent for 18 months. I continued consulting my notes with the precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence. Your restaurants are losing money every quarter, your commercial properties are generating negative cash flow, and you've been using personal assets to cover business expenses for over a year. Frank sat down heavily, looking every one of his 73 years. How could you possibly know all that? Because I'm good at my job, Frank. Because I understand financial statements and business operations in market conditions. Because I have the expertise you've been dismissing for 20 years, and I finally decided to use it for my own benefit instead of waiting for permission to help you. Kevin spoke for the first time since I'd arrived. So what's your endgame here, Claire? You buy the Rosewood and then what? You hold our Easter dinners hostage until we… What? Apologize for hurting your feelings. I looked at Kevin, the youngest and least diplomatic of the Lawson children, and smiled with genuine appreciation for his directness. My endgame is building a successful restaurant business. Your Easter dinners are irrelevant to that goal. But since you asked, let me be clear about the new terms of our relationship. I walked back to my seat and sat down, crossing my legs and settling in as if I were conducting a business presentation. Which in many ways I was. First, Derek and I will be separating our finances immediately. I've already spoken to my lawyer about protecting my business assets from any potential liability related to your family's debts. Derek's head snapped up. Claire, you can't be serious. I'm completely serious. You've demonstrated that you can't be trusted to make financial decisions that consider my interests, so I'm removing myself from exposure to your poor judgment. Second, I continued, if you want to maintain any relationship with me going forward, you will treat me with the respect due to a successful business owner and industry professional. No more dismissive comments about my work. No more exclusion from family discussions that affect me. No more condescending explanations about how I wouldn't understand your world. Patricia opened her mouth to object, but I held up a hand to stop her. The Rosewood Bistro will operate as a business, not as your family's private dining room. If you want to celebrate Easter there, you'll make reservations and pay for your meals like everyone else. The days of special treatment and comp dinners are over. And if we don't agree to these terms? Brenda asked, her voice tight with anger. Then you don't. But you also don't get to pretend that I'm the problem here. You've created this situation through years of excluding me and months of financial mismanagement. I'm simply responding to the reality you've forced me to confront. The room fell silent again, as the family absorbed what I'd said. I could see them exchanging glances, trying to figure out how to respond to a version of me they'd never encountered before. Frank was the first to speak. Claire, I think you're letting your emotions cloud your business judgment. Buying a restaurant out of spite is rarely a successful strategy. You're right, I agreed. That's why I'm not buying it out of spite. I'm buying it because it's a profitable operation with growth potential, because Tony is motivated to sell to someone who will preserve what he's built, and because I have the capital and expertise to make it more successful than it's ever been. And the spite is just a bonus. Tom asked with a slight smirk. I looked at him directly. Tom, in my 20 years of experience in restaurant consulting, I've learned that the most successful business decisions are the ones that serve multiple purposes. Yes, I'm angry about how this family has treated me. But I'm also genuinely excited about the opportunity to own and operate a restaurant of the Rosewood's caliber. Derek finally found his voice. Claire, what about us? What about our marriage? It was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The question that would determine whether the next phase of my life would include Derek or not. That depends on you, I said quietly. If you can accept that I'm no longer the woman who will wait patiently for permission to participate in decisions that affect my life, then maybe we have something to work with. If you can't, then we don't. You're asking me to choose between you and my family. No, Derek, I'm asking you to choose between treating me as an equal partner, or continuing to treat me as a dependent who doesn't deserve full information or input into major decisions. Patricia stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking. This is ridiculous. Claire, you're destroying this family over imagined slights and hurt feelings. I stood up as well, and something in my posture made everyone else sit back slightly. Patricia, there's nothing imagined about being excluded from family financial discussions while my own assets were at risk. There's nothing imagined about watching my husband lie to me for months about your family's situation. There's nothing imagined about spending 20 years being treated like a perpetual house guest in my own marriage. We never treated you like a house guest, she protested. Really? Then why wasn't I invited to the family meetings where you planned how to handle your financial crisis? Why wasn't my professional expertise considered valuable enough to warrant inclusion? Why has Derek been making major financial decisions without consulting me? Patricia looked around the room for support, but found none. Even Frank seemed to recognize that their position wasn't defensible. You want to know the real irony here? I continued, if you had included me from the beginning, I could have helped you avoid most of this mess. I could have identified the operational problems that were bleeding money. I could have suggested restructuring strategies that might have prevented the crisis. I could have connected you with investors or buyers who were serious about preserving family businesses. Instead, you chose to exclude me, to lie to me, and to risk my financial security without my knowledge or consent. So now, instead of helping you save your business, I'm buying the most successful piece of it for myself. Frank leaned back in his chair, looking defeated. So that's it. You're just going to stand by and watch us lose everything. Frank, you've been losing everything for months. I'm not causing that to happen. I'm just refusing to go down with the ship when I wasn't allowed to help navigate. Derek stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the garden where we'd had countless family barbecues and celebrations. Claire, if you do this, there's no going back. You'll be destroying relationships that took decades to build. Derek, those relationships were built on a foundation of inequality and exclusion. If they can't survive me asserting my right to be treated with respect, then maybe they weren't as strong as you thought. The meeting ended shortly after that, with the family agreeing to think about what I'd said, as if they had any real choice in the matter. Derek and I drove home in silence, both of us processing the reality that our marriage had fundamentally changed in the space of a single evening. That night, Derek slept in the guest room. Not because we'd fought, exactly, but because we both needed space to think about what came next. The following morning, I received a call from Tony Ritchie, asking if I was still planning to meet that afternoon to finalize the purchase agreement. I assured him that I was, and spent the morning reviewing contracts and financial documents with my lawyer. At 2 o'clock, I walked into Tony's lawyer's office as Claire Brennan, successful restaurant consultant. At 4 o'clock, I walked out as Claire Brennan, owner of the Rosewood Bistro. Tony handed me the keys with a mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. You take good care of this place, Claire. Oh. It's been my life's work. I will, Tony, and thank you for trusting me with it. That evening, I stood alone in my new restaurant, walking through the dining room and kitchen, imagining the changes I wanted to make and the success I planned to achieve. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely excited about the future. Derek came home late that night, and we sat together in our living room having the conversation that would determine whether our marriage survived the choices we'd both made. I don't understand how we got here, he said finally. We got here because you chose loyalty to your family's dysfunction over partnership with your wife. We got here because you decided that protecting their pride was more important than including me in decisions that affected both of us. Derek was quiet for a long time. What do you need from me, Claire? Oh. What would it take to fix this? I looked at the man I'd shared my life with for 20 years, and I realized that the answer to his question would determine not just the future of our marriage, but the kind of person I was going to be going forward. I need you to choose me, Derek. Not instead of your family, but equally with them. I need you to see me as a partner worthy of honesty and respect, not as someone who needs to be managed and protected from difficult realities. And if I can't, then You've made your choice, and we both have to live with the consequences. Over the next few days, as word spread through Portland's restaurant community that I had purchased the Rosewood, I received dozens of congratulatory calls and messages. Industry colleagues who had known me for years expressed excitement about my venture into ownership. Suppliers and contractors offered their services. Restaurant reviewers asked about my plans for the menu and concept. It was gratifying to be recognized and celebrated for a professional achievement, something that had been notably absent from my interactions with the Lawson family. The one call I didn't receive was from Derek's family. They were apparently still thinking about my terms, as if they had any real leverage in the situation. That changed on Friday afternoon, when Patricia called and asked if we could meet for coffee. Just the two of us. I agreed, curious about what approach she planned to take. We met at a neutral location, a small cafe in downtown Portland that neither of us frequented regularly. Patricia arrived looking every inch the patrician matriarch she'd always been, but I could see the strain around her eyes and the tension in her shoulders. The financial crisis was taking its toll. "Claire, I want to understand what you really want from us," she began without preamble. "I want what I've always wanted, Patricia. Respect, inclusion, the courtesy of being treated like family instead of like an outsider who married into it." She stirred her coffee slowly, choosing her words carefully. "I think there may have been misunderstandings on both sides. Perhaps we haven't always communicated as clearly as we should have." It was a diplomatic non-apology, the kind of careful language wealthy people used when they needed to acknowledge fault without actually admitting wrongdoing. "Patricia, let me save us both some time. I know you're here to negotiate. You want me to agree to something that preserves your family's dignity while minimizing the consequences of your exclusionary behavior. You probably have a proposal that involves me selling the restaurant back to you at cost, or agreeing to some kind of partnership arrangement that puts you back in control." Her slight smile confirmed that I'd guessed correctly. "The problem," I continued, "is that I'm not interested in negotiations that restore the status quo. I'm interested in building a successful business and being treated with the respect I should have received 20 years ago. And our Easter dinners." I leaned back in my chair, studying the woman who had spent 2 decades making me feel like I didn't belong in my own marriage. "Patricia, let me ask you something. In all the years I've been part of your Easter celebrations, have you ever once asked me about my family traditions? Have you ever inquired about how my mother and I used to celebrate holidays before I married Derek?" She looked genuinely confused by the question. No, I don't believe so. "Have you ever considered that I might have ideas about how to make the celebrations more meaningful or inclusive? Have you ever asked for my input on menu planning or decorations or activities for the children? You never seemed interested in those kinds of domestic details." I laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to make her flinch. "Patricia, I own a restaurant consulting business. I've planned hundreds of events. I'm extremely interested in domestic details. I just never felt like my interest was welcomed." She was quiet for a moment, and I could see her trying to process the idea that she might have misunderstood my personality for 20 years. "What do you want from us going forward?" she asked finally. "I want you to earn the right to celebrate Easter at my restaurant. I want you to demonstrate that you can treat me with respect and appreciation instead of condescension and exclusion. I want your family to acknowledge that they've spent 20 years dismissing someone who could have been an asset instead of a liability. And if we do that—" I smiled, and for the first time in our conversation it was genuine. "Then maybe we can build something better than what we had before. Maybe we can have Easter dinners where everyone feels valued and included. Maybe we can have family relationships based on mutual respect instead of hierarchical tolerance." Patricia nodded slowly. "I'll need to discuss this with Frank and the children." "Of course you will. Just remember that time is not on your side. Every day you spend debating whether to treat me with respect is another day I'm building my business without any consideration for your family's preferences." As I walked back to my car after our meeting, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't experienced in years. I had finally said everything I'd wanted to say to the Lawson family. I had finally taken actions that reflected my own values and priorities instead of deferring to theirs. Whether they chose to meet my terms or not, I had already won the most important victory. I had reclaimed my own power and self-respect. The rest would be determined by their choices, not mine. The weeks that followed my acquisition of the Rosewood Bistro were a whirlwind of activity that left no time for dwelling on family drama or marital uncertainty. I threw myself into restaurant ownership with the same intensity I'd brought to consulting, but with the added satisfaction of building something that was entirely mine. My first priority was meeting with every member of the existing staff to understand their perspectives on the restaurant's operations and to assure them that the change in ownership wouldn't mean mass layoffs or dramatic operational changes. The kitchen staff, led by Chef Marco Santos, had been with Tony for over a decade and possessed institutional knowledge that would be impossible to replace. Mr. Ritchie, he always treated us like family, Marco told me during our first meeting. We heard good things about you from him, but we need to know, are you going to respect what we've built here? Marco, I'm going to do better than respect it. I'm going to help you elevate it. I've seen the financial numbers and the customer feedback. You're already running an excellent operation. My job is to provide the resources and support you need to make it even better. Over the following days, I worked with Marco and the front-of-house manager Jennifer Walsh to identify operational improvements that could increase efficiency without sacrificing quality. Small changes to workflow, strategic updates to the menu pricing, and investments in equipment that would reduce food waste and prep time. The results were almost immediate. Within 2 weeks, we had reduced food costs by 12% while actually improving portion consistency. Staff morale was higher because they felt heard and valued in ways they hadn't experienced in years of Tony's well-meaning but increasingly distracted management. I also began implementing marketing strategies that Tony had never explored. Social media presence, partnerships with local food bloggers, and special events that showcased Marco's culinary talents. The Rosewood had always been known for solid, reliable food and service. I wanted it to be known as a destination. The financial performance exceeded my projections. October revenue was up 18% over the previous year, despite the restaurant business typically slowing down as Portland's weather turned gray and rainy. November looked even more promising, with several large private party bookings and a waiting list for Friday and Saturday nights. The success was professionally satisfying, but it was also personally validating. After 20 years of having my business expertise dismissed by the Lawson family, I was proving to myself and to Portland's restaurant community that my instincts and abilities were everything I'd claimed them to be. Derek had been watching my transformation with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. He came home each evening to find me energized and excited about my work in ways I hadn't been in years. But he also saw the changes in how I carried myself, how I made decisions without seeking his input or approval, how I had essentially created a life that didn't require his participation. 3 weeks after I purchased the Rosewood, he finally asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Claire, are we going to make it through this?" We were sitting in our living room after dinner, and I was reviewing reservation reports on my laptop while he watched television with distracted attention. "That depends," I said without looking up from my screen. "Are you willing to be married to the woman I've become, or do you need me to go back to being the woman I was?" Derek muted the television and turned to face me fully. "I never wanted you to be anyone other than who you are. Derek, that's not true, and we both know it. You wanted me to be someone who didn't ask difficult questions about your family's finances. You wanted me to be someone who accepted exclusion gracefully and didn't challenge the established hierarchy. You wanted me to be someone whose professional expertise was irrelevant to family discussions." He was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him wrestling with the accuracy of what I'd said. "Maybe you're right, maybe I did want those things because they made my life easier. But I never meant to diminish you. Intent doesn't matter as much as impact, Derek. The impact was that I felt dismissed and undervalued for 20 years. The impact was that I spent 2 decades trying to earn approval from people who had decided I wasn't worth listening to." Derek got up and walked to the window, his usual habit when he needed to think through difficult problems. "What would it look like if we tried to fix this? What would you need from me?" I closed my laptop and looked at him directly. "I'd need you to stop being the mediator between me and your family and start being my partner. I'd need you to support my decisions even when they conflict with what your family wants. I'd need you to see our marriage as the primary relationship in your life, not as something that has to accommodate everyone else's expectations. And if I can do that, then maybe we can build something better than what we had. Maybe we can have a marriage where we're actually partners instead of roommates who happen to share finances and social obligations." Derek came back to the couch and sat down beside me. "I want to try, Claire. I know I've been weak when it came to standing up to my family, but I don't want to lose you over it." It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a beginning. Over the following weeks, Derek made small but noticeable efforts to change how he interacted with both me and his family. He started asking about my restaurant plans and offering genuine input instead of just polite interest. He stopped immediately deferring to his parents' opinions when we discussed our own decisions. Most importantly, when his family finally called a meeting to discuss their response to my ultimatum, Derek told them he wouldn't attend unless I was invited as an equal participant, not as someone whose presence was grudgingly tolerated. The meeting took place in early December, at the Rosewood Bistro. I had suggested the location partly for convenience, and partly because I wanted the psychological advantage of being on my own territory. The Lawson family arrived looking like they were attending a funeral, rather than a negotiation. Frank wore the grim expression of a man who had spent weeks confronting the reality of his financial situation. Patricia maintained her composure, but I could see the effort it required. Brenda and Kevin looked resentful, like children forced to apologize for behavior they didn't believe was wrong. We gathered in the private dining room, where they had celebrated so many Easter dinners, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone. The room that had once represented their exclusion of me was now the place where we would determine the terms of any future relationship. Frank spoke first, his voice carrying none of its usual authority. "Claire, we've discussed your concerns, as a family, and we recognize that there may have been miscommunications over the years." "Miscommunications," I repeated. "Is that what we're calling 20 years of systematic exclusion?" Patricia intervened with the diplomatic skills she'd honed over decades of managing social situations. "Claire, we're here because we want to find a way forward that works for everyone. We value your place in our family, and we hope you can find a way to value your place in ours." "My place in your family has always been conditional, Patricia. Conditional on my not asking difficult questions, conditional on my accepting exclusion gracefully, conditional on my not challenging decisions that affected me. I'm not interested in conditional inclusion anymore." Brenda leaned forward, her frustration finally bubbling to the surface. "Claire, what exactly do you want from us? An apology? Fine. We're sorry if you felt excluded. We're sorry if you felt like your opinions didn't matter. Are you happy now?" I looked at Brenda with something approaching pity. "Brenda, that's not an apology. That's a dismissal, disguised as an acknowledgement. You're sorry if I felt excluded, not sorry that you excluded me. You're sorry if I felt like my opinions didn't matter, not sorry that you dismissed them. What's the difference?" "The difference is ownership. Real apologies acknowledge wrongdoing, not just the other person's reaction to wrongdoing." Derek surprised me by speaking up. "Claire's right. We did exclude her. We did dismiss her expertise. We did make family decisions without considering how they affected her. And we did all of that because it was easier than acknowledging that our approach to family business was flawed." The silence that followed Derek's statement was profound. For the first time in 20 years, a member of the Lawson family had publicly acknowledged that their treatment of me was wrong, not just misunderstood. Frank cleared his throat awkwardly. "Derek, we never intended. Dad, intent doesn't matter. Claire has been trying to tell us for years that she felt excluded, and we kept explaining why her feelings were wrong instead of examining our behavior." Kevin rolled his eyes. "So what, now we're supposed to pretend that Claire's some kind of victim who's been suffering in silence? She's a successful businesswoman. If she had a problem with how we did things, she could have spoken up." I smiled at Kevin's comment, recognizing the trap he'd just set for himself. "You're right, Kevin. I could have spoken up. And I did, many times. I offered professional advice that was dismissed. I asked to be included in financial discussions and was told they weren't my concern. I suggested operational improvements that were ignored. When none of that worked, I found another way to make my voice heard. By buying our restaurant," Kevin said bitterly. "By buying a restaurant that was for sale to anyone with the capital and expertise to run it successfully. The fact that your family had an emotional attachment to the Rosewood doesn't give you proprietary rights to it." Frank finally spoke the words that had been hanging over the entire conversation. "Claire, what do you want us to do? We can't undo 20 years of miscommunications. We can't go back and include you in discussions that already happened. What would satisfy you going forward?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been thinking about for weeks. "I want you to earn the right to be welcome in my restaurant. I want you to demonstrate through your actions that you understand why your previous behavior was hurtful and exclusionary. I want you to show me that you can treat me as an equal member of this family, instead of an outsider who married into it." "How do we do that?" Patricia asked. You start by acknowledging that I have valuable expertise and insights that could benefit all of us. You continue by including me in discussions that affect me, even when those discussions are about family business. You demonstrate respect for my professional accomplishments and stop treating my success as a hobby. I paused, looking around the table at faces that ranged from resigned to resentful. And you accept that I now own a business that's important to your family traditions. If you want to continue celebrating Easter here, you do it as customers, not as people with special privileges. Brenda's composure finally cracked completely. So you're holding our Easter dinners hostage until we grovel for your forgiveness. That's your solution. Brenda, I'm running a business according to standard business practices. If you want to reserve the private dining room for Easter, you make a reservation and pay for it like any other customer. The days of assuming you get special treatment because of your last name are over. But we have history with this place. We helped Tony when he was struggling. We've been loyal customers for 20 years. And that history will be honored. Loyal customers get excellent service, personal attention, and the kind of hospitality that makes them feel valued. They don't get free meals and exclusive access. The meeting continued for another hour, with various family members proposing compromises that would give them some of their old privileges, while requiring minimal change in their behavior toward me. I rejected each proposal politely but firmly. Finally, Derek asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. Claire, do you want us to celebrate Easter here, or would you prefer we find somewhere else? I looked at my husband, the man who was finally starting to understand that being married to me meant choosing me, not just accommodating me. Derek, I want you to celebrate Easter wherever you'll be happiest. If that's here, you're welcome to make a reservation. If it's somewhere else, I understand completely. But the decision needs to be based on whether you want to be customers at my restaurant, not on whether you can negotiate special treatment that makes you feel like you still control this space. The meeting ended with the family agreeing to consider my terms, though we all knew they didn't have much choice. Their financial situation was deteriorating rapidly, and they couldn't afford to alienate the one person who might be able to help them salvage something from their collapsing empire. Over the following weeks, I received individual calls from various family members. Frank asked if I'd be willing to consult on the sale of their remaining properties. Patricia inquired about catering services for a scaled-down version of her annual charity event. Kevin wondered if there might be employment opportunities at the Rosewood for someone with his business background. Each conversation was a small acknowledgement that my expertise was valuable, that my success was real, and that they needed me more than I needed them. The most significant call came from Derek's cousin Martha, who had been notably absent from the family drama, but had apparently been watching it unfold with interest. Claire, I wanted to call and tell you how impressed I've been with how you've handled this whole situation, she said during a conversation that caught me completely off guard. I've been watching this family dismiss strong women for decades, and it's about time someone stood up to them. Martha, I appreciate you saying that, but I wasn't trying to make a statement about strong women. I was just trying to be treated with respect. Same thing, really. And I wanted you to know that there are members of this family who think you've been treated poorly for years. We just didn't know how to say anything without causing more family drama. It was a conversation that helped me understand that the Lawson family dynamics were more complex than I'd realized, and that my situation had been noticed and discussed by people who hadn't felt empowered to intervene. Christmas came and went with a cautious detente between Derek and me and his family. We exchanged gifts and shared meals, but the underlying tension remained. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen when Easter arrived, and the family had to decide whether to make a reservation at my restaurant or find somewhere else to celebrate. The winter months were incredibly busy at the Rosewood. Portland's restaurant scene was competitive, but word was spreading about the improvements we'd made and the quality of our service. Food bloggers started featuring us in their recommendations. The Portland Business Journal wrote an article about successful restaurant turnarounds that highlighted our operational improvements. Most satisfying was the recognition I received from industry colleagues who had been watching my transition from consultant to owner with professional interest. I was invited to speak on panels about restaurant management and asked to mentor other women looking to enter restaurant ownership. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was being seen and valued for who I actually was, not for who someone else needed me to be. In February, Derek and I had another of our ongoing conversations about the future of our marriage. We were making progress, but both of us recognized that we were essentially learning how to be married to each other all over again. "Do you ever regret buying the Rosewood?" he asked one evening, as we worked together in our kitchen, a domestic routine that had become more relaxed and companionable than it had been in years. "Never," I replied without hesitation. "It's the best decision I've made in decades. I love the work, I love the challenge, and I love feeling like I'm building something meaningful, even if it complicated our marriage." I turned to face him fully. "Derek, our marriage was already complicated. I just stopped pretending it wasn't." Spring arrived early that year, and with it came the inevitable question of Easter plans. In mid-March, Derek approached me with a request that felt like a test of everything we'd been working toward. "Claire, my family wants to make a reservation for Easter dinner. They're ready to do it properly, pay for their meals, treat the staff with respect, acknowledge that they're customers rather than family with special privileges." I smiled, recognizing the significance of what he was telling me. "Then they should call and make a reservation like any other customers. They're nervous about calling directly. They're afraid you might say no out of spite." "Derek, I don't operate my business out of spite. I operate it according to professional standards. If they want to make a reservation, and they're willing to behave like respectful customers, they're welcome." The call came the next day from Patricia, her voice carefully formal as she requested a reservation for 22 people on Easter Sunday. I checked our availability and confirmed the booking, quoting our standard rates for the private dining room and discussing menu options with the same professionalism I'd offer any customer. "Thank you, Claire," Patricia said at the end of our conversation. "We appreciate your willingness to accommodate us." "Of course, Patricia, we look forward to providing you with excellent service." It was a small exchange, but it represented a fundamental shift in our relationship. For the first time in 20 years, Patricia Lawson was asking me for something rather than expecting it. Easter Sunday arrived with the kind of perfect spring weather that made Portland feel like the most beautiful city in the world. The Rosewood was fully booked for brunch and dinner, a testament to the reputation we'd built over the past 6 months. I arrived early to oversee the final preparations, working with Marco and Jennifer to ensure that every detail was perfect, not just for the Lawson family, but for all our guests. This was our first Easter as owners, and I wanted it to be memorable for all the right reasons. The Lawson family arrived at 6 o'clock, dressed in their Easter finery, and carrying themselves with the careful dignity of people who were trying very hard to be on their best behavior. I greeted them in the lobby with the warm professionalism I offered all our guests. "Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Rosewood. Your table is ready, and Chef Marco has prepared something special for tonight's menu." As I led them to the private dining room, I noticed the small changes in their demeanor. Frank thanked the hostess who took his coat. Patricia complimented the seasonal decorations we'd added to the dining room. Brenda asked Jennifer about wine pairings, with the kind of genuine interest she'd never shown when the meals were complimentary. They were behaving like customers, and in doing so they were treating my staff and me with more respect than they'd shown in 20 years of family celebrations. The dinner was a success by every measure. The food was exceptional, the service was attentive, and the conversation was more relaxed than any family gathering I could remember. Without the tension of unspoken resentments and unacknowledged hierarchies, we were able to enjoy each other's company in ways that had previously seemed impossible. As the evening wound down, and the family prepared to leave, Frank approached me with an expression that was both grateful and slightly sheepish. "Claire, thank you for a wonderful evening. The food was outstanding, and your staff provided exactly the kind of service we've always appreciated here." "Thank you, Frank. I'm glad you enjoyed it." He hesitated for a moment, then continued. "I also want to apologize for how long it took us to recognize your accomplishments. You've built something remarkable here, and you've done it with the kind of professionalism and integrity that our family should have acknowledged years ago." It was the apology I'd been waiting for, delivered without conditions or qualifications. An acknowledgement of wrongdoing rather than just regret about my reaction to their behavior. "I appreciate you saying that, Frank. It means a lot coming from you." Patricia joined us, and for the first time in our relationship, she looked at me with something approaching respect. "Claire, I know we haven't always made you feel welcome in our family, and I'm sorry for that. You've shown us what grace under pressure looks like, and I hope we can learn from your example. As the family left that evening, I felt a sense of completion that went beyond professional satisfaction. I had proven to myself and to them that I was capable of building something successful and meaningful. I had demonstrated that being excluded from their circle hadn't diminished me, it had freed me to create my own. Derek lingered after the others had gone, helping me lock up and turn off the lights in what had become our new tradition. "How do you feel?" he asked, as we walked to our cars in the parking lot. "Proud," I said. "Proud of what we've built here, proud of how we handled tonight, and proud of how far we've all come. Do you think we can make it? The marriage, I mean." I looked at the man I'd married 20 years earlier, who was still learning how to be the partner I needed him to be. "I think we're going to be fine, Derek. We're different people than we were when we got married, but maybe that's not a bad thing." As we drove home separately, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. A year ago, I had been a successful consultant who felt invisible in her own marriage. Tonight I was a restaurant owner who had transformed not just a business, but an entire network of family relationships. I had learned that sometimes the most important changes come not from trying to fix what's broken, but from building something new entirely. I had discovered that respect couldn't be demanded or negotiated, it had to be earned through actions that demonstrated competence and integrity. Most importantly, I had proven to myself that I didn't need anyone else's permission to claim my own power and create the life I wanted to live. The Rosewood Bistro continued to thrive, becoming one of Portland's most respected restaurants. The Lawson family became some of our most loyal customers, treating the staff with appreciation and paying their bills without complaint. Derek and I rebuilt our marriage on a foundation of mutual respect and partnership, learning to be allies rather than adversaries in navigating family relationships and business challenges. And every Easter, as I watched the Lawson family celebrate in the private dining room of my restaurant, I was reminded that the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting better. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to remain invisible, claiming your place at the table, and building something so successful that others have no choice but to recognize your worth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.